so much of the stuff in the Epstein files is about the United States' role in the world as well, and the exercise of men's power in the world.
What was the Iraq War all about? We can topple the bad guy, throw a copy of the Federalist Papers into Baghdad and get the heck out of Dodge.
I could not disagree with everything you've said more, but I will try and do it politely.
But I think what the last few weeks have revealed, it's actually about dismantling the fundamental moral principle that underpinned international law, which is quite a straightforward one, really. It's that killing people is bad.
Hi, I'm Zim and Clare.
And I'm Claire Corbould.
We're a couple of academics with a passion for US politics.
And a mission to find meaning in a world that often defies it. This is Presidency Upending. Okay.
Today we're trying something a little bit different because we have two esteemed guests on our podcast.
Yeah, it's a bit squeezy in here. Our first guest is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program. Emma is a historian and writer focused on the history and politics of the United States and its role in the world, especially Australia. Her books include one that's titled Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States. She's a regular media commentator and host of the excellent podcast called After America. Welcome to the pod, Emma.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Our second guest is Professor Tim Lynch, Professor of American Politics and co-chair of Political Science at the University of Melbourne. Tim has written extensively on US politics and foreign policy, including books titled In the Shadow of the Cold War and co-authored with Robert Singh, After Bush, The Case for Continuity in American Foreign Policy. Tim, welcome to Presidency Upending.
It is a great pleasure to be here, Zim and Claire.
So as this is our first episode of 2026, we thought it's a good moment to take stock of some broader trends. So our discussion today will cover change and continuity in American foreign policy, the state of democracy in this year, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Republic, and given our guests' very wide-ranging expertise, we also discuss what all of this means for Australia and what we should be watching in both countries in the short and medium term.
We are recording on the 18th of March 2026 on unceded Wurundjeri country and pay our respects to their elders past and present. Let's start with foreign policy. There's obviously a lot happening in the headlines in any one week, but let's begin a bit more broadly than that. It feels as though we're in a moment where the world order is changing. American power is still immense, and the order that America helped to build is looking shakier, less coherent, and less legitimate than it did even a few years ago. Let's begin with Emma. When you look at the current moment in US foreign policy, including events that we've seen recently in Venezuela and Iran, what strikes you as most important?
I think in the last couple of weeks, especially, Zim, I've been thinking about this a great deal because we've seen in many respects the continuity of US foreign policy and the way that, you know, in many ways Donald Trump is a prisoner, I think, of that history and not necessarily directing it. But I think what has struck me most about that is the way that the Trump administration is approaching the United States' role in the world does have a lot of continuity, of course, with particularly the war on terror and the Bush administration. But what it doesn't have is even a willingness, I think, to signal to the principles of international law in the way that previous administrations have done. And it's been an express project of the Trump administration to undermine the institutions of international law. But I think what the last few weeks have revealed is that it's not just about that. It's not just about dismantling international law. It's actually about dismantling the fundamental moral principle that underpinned international law, which is quite a straightforward one, really. It's that killing people is bad and unnecessary suffering is bad. If you listen to high-level officials in the Trump administration, including the Secretary of Defense, that is gone. They're taking, it seems, great pleasure in killing people and being unbound by what they describe as the stupid rules of engagement. You know, you have a president talking about bombing new sites or, you know, rebombing sites in Iran just for fun. And I think that fundamental erosion is actually the most worrying thing about American foreign policy today.
Tim, you've written a lot about continuity in US foreign policy. I mean, it's one of the arguments that you've made consistently over many books and, long and, I don't want to say long and distinguished career, you're not old enough for that. And in particular, you argued in 2008 that the anti-Islamist mindset of the George W. Bush presidency, which Emma has just alluded to, would continue for the future. You were certainly right with the Obama presidency. Do you see that as part of what's going on in this administration? Do you see any change from the argument you made in 2008?
So I share much of what Emma has said, but depart significantly as well. So the continuity, I think, needs to be articulated is the national security concern of every president since 9/11. And that concern, though it's kind of fallen off the radar, is preventing the nexus of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. It's what gave W. Bush, his central purpose after the attacks of that terrible day. And it's the national security priority that Obama very deliberately decided to walk in lockstep with, in some ways to counter concerns that he was a very different kind of Democrat. He bought in wholesale to the national security imperatives of the Bush administration, and I think delivered something like a third Bush term. You could argue a bit more competent version of the Bush term, and you document this and measure this by how far he was willing to violate international law in pursuit of this counterterrorism agenda. He kills terrorists, signs kill lists most mornings, kills prodigiously in a way that George Bush couldn't. I mean, this is also a function of increasing technology of drones, but it does reveal what should have been two of the most contrasting administrations in recent American history were actually identical when it came to the nature of the threat and articulating what the threat was. Of course, what we then got to factor in is how far Trump is an inheritor of this national security architecture, and I think mostly he is. And we don't have to indulge notions of Islamophobia, which I think are always overstated. He has, as one of the rationales, and he shifts on a daily basis on what explains the Iran war, but one of them very quickly cited was precluding this terrorist regime getting hold of a nuclear capacity. Well, that's part of the inherited tradition that Trump finds himself having to work within, and he's extended it. We can argue that he's done it badly. It seems to me he's at least as incompetent thus far in his attack on Iran as George W. Bush was in his attack on Iraq, but it's driven by similar, if not identical, motivations.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, I was going to, but you go first.
Thanks. So, I mean, given there were no weapons of mass destruction in 2003, and evidently Iran does not have anything like the capability that Trump suggested that Iran had prior to and at the very beginning of this conflict, how does that affect your argument?
Well, in some, it's a good response. I wonder if that doesn't make my argument more certain.
Right.
WMD was a chimera. I mean, I don't think it was a conspiracy. I think there was a genuine failure of intelligence. But that's matched, I think, by Trump's insistence since June last year that he's completely decimated Iran's nuclear capacity, and yet last month he attacked because he wasn't sure he'd eliminated that capacity. So I think.
So in other words, there's a continuity of kind of
over-inflated
national security
and we can
concerns.
argue about whether this stems from a genuine failure of intelligence. I don't mean intelligence in a IQ sense. I mean a failure of the world's most sophisticated intelligence gathering machine, the American government, to actually pinpoint what the nature of the threat is. Bush was a victim of that, and I think Trump may be a similar victim of that.
I would like to pull at that thread a little bit more. Tim, you've thought a lot about the actions of different administrations over time. You have as well, Emma. And one thing that I'm always curious about is the fundamental question of what makes America safe? Like what does bring security? Because we see American presidents arguing for different kinds of actions. What, in your view, taking a step back, brings security to the United States?
Oh, I think you'd have to define what security means. I think I'd start at the very beginning. 250 years ago, America was born in fear. And its security, at least for the first 4 or 5 decades, was elusive. And then when that security is achieved after a war with Mexico, you then have the onset of the Civil War. So security has been a very rationed commodity in American history. And we make the mistake of looking at it on the map, and it's got friendly neighbours north and south, and east and west are fish, and forget that for its initial phase of development, it was contended over by the superpowers of the day. It has engaged itself in global wars in the First, Second, and Cold War, premised on the notion that security was imminently threatened, ideologically, territorially. The concern with security is to call it a national obsession, I think it may be too strong. But if you're France or you're Germany or you're Russia or China even, I think there is a clear and obvious threat on your borders across your history, which America really has not shared in the same way. But in some interesting psychological transition, America has adopted many of the territorial obsessions we should expect it to be free from. And I wonder, just finally on this, whether its ideological approach is a manifestation of that geographic understanding of its situation, that it seeks ideological confrontation and readily finds it. And every war, I think I'd make this claim, every significant war at some way has been justified in ideological terms, because unless this alien ideology is checked, America is next. America is vulnerable.
And Emma, how do you see the sources of American security and insecurity?
Well, I think, I mean, Tim asks the right fundamental question. What do we mean by security? What do we mean by safety? And I think that's where, I would agree with Tim that Trump is in many ways a prisoner of this ideological history in the United States, where there's this idea that you can dominate your way to security, that you can bomb your way to peace. And it's been really striking again in the last couple of weeks to see administration surrogates like Stephen Miller, for example, policy advisor in the White House, talk about asymmetric warfare and that this is the most asymmetric war the United States has ever fought, which is tapping into that continuity of an attempt to create security by, I guess, outsourcing those wars to long distances from the United States and attempting to bomb opposition into submission. The United States tried this in Vietnam, they tried it in Afghanistan, they tried it in Iraq, and now they're trying it again in Iran. And that does buy, I think, on many occasions, an immediate sense of security, an immediate sense of dominance, of overwhelming military might. But what it does in the long term for the United States is bake in deep insecurity, because then you have regimes, often abhorrent regimes, that are committed not only to opposing the United States, but just to survival. And the mythology that drives much of the Trump administration is that previous administrations just haven't taken this idea far enough. They haven't bombed enough. They haven't used enough force. They've been too weak or too woke or too bound by stupid rules of engagement. And that's why this administration can do it, can win, can create a level of American security, which I think is a fundamental miscalculation, because it's also not matched by an investment in long-term security in the same way that the United States did after the Second World War, where it committed, extraordinary amounts of money to the rebuilding of Europe, not just in terms of rebuilding from destruction, but in terms of rebuilding economies and rebuilding people's ability to feed themselves. There's never really been an understanding in the United States of the need for that as well.
Yes. Again, I share that, but not the conclusion. That what we're dealing with is a nation that's actually lacks the necessary imperial will to finish the wars it starts. Emma is right to draw attention to Germany and Japan. And of course, America is complicit in the devastation of these nations, dropping a bomb atomic bomb on one of them, but then sticks around and rebuilds them, and they become the economic miracles of the late 20th century. It was America's imperial will, I don't have another way of describing it, that made that transformation possible. What we've seen since the end of the Cold War, I might even include Vietnam in this, but certainly since the end of the Cold War, is this understanding that through air war you can achieve the kind of lasting regime change and transformations that it took occupation over decades to achieve. Trump is victim to this same approach. When Bill Clinton rained bombs on Serbia for 78 days without an international legal mandate to do so, leading eventually to the death of Slobodan Milosevic in a Hague prison 6 years later, he was trusting that air war and an aversion to boots on the ground would do the job, that they know long-term occupation requires. And Trump is part of that syndrome. I think George W. Bush sets the real marker here. What was the Iraq War all about? We can topple the bad guy, throw a copy of the Federalist Papers into Baghdad, and get the heck out of Dodge. There was no ambition to stay the course. Now, we can have an argument about the left, which I'm very keen to kick because I think it's culpable for a lot of things. But we have a political vocabulary in the West which calls this neo-colonialism, and we do acknowledgements of country, and we chastise ourselves for the invasion of foreign lands, and we forget this may sometimes be necessary, as Germany and Japan proved, for the long-term prospects of peace and prosperity.
Oh, I don't think I can let that one go. I mean, settler colonialism is quite different from the colonialism that's being referenced in neo-colonialism.
I think
so you would draw a bow from acknowledgement of country to bombing Iraq.
We don't have a political vocabulary which would enable us to assert that Western power sometimes is a necessary ingredient in the creation of peace. We have the default position. This is a complicated one, but I think we lack an understanding of Western power, European power. And I think Europe is a very good illustration of this. It's been quite complicit in the isolation of Iran over a number of decades through sanctions, the designation of it as a terrorist regime, whilst at the same time trying to appease this notion that it's a cosmopolitan power and that radical ideology that drives Tehran isn't part of some civilizational threat. And Trump, for all his faults, has found a way of articulating an American interest. I think he's failing to realize it, at least to this point in the Iran war, that all the leaders that are trying to appease him in Europe have failed to do. And that's the disjuncture we're dealing with.
But another disjuncture, just to jump in here, is that back in the 1940s, the United States was prepared to invest in institution building, societal building.
In its own interest,
in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, in South Korea, and so on. In its own interest, but also with a degree of foresight that understood that allowing the indigenous population to choose their leaders and to run their own affairs was actually in the United States' long-term interest. So what happened to that kind of pressure?
Well, yes, you've outlined a crucial part of 20th century history. One of the greatest forces, with the exception of the indigenous populations themselves, look at Africa, was American power. This chief catalyst of the decline of the British Empire was American power. So it's always seen itself, this is one of it, why it's such a complicated thing to understand. It's a deeply anti-colonial power. It's anti-imperial. That line, what's the biggest film franchise in world history? It's Star Wars. It's a war against an evil empire. So it doesn't do empire, whilst at the same time constructing an imperial system that it's not willing to admit exists. And you end up in wars where they try and do it on the cheap. In Iraq and Iran, where you try and bomb transformations, and transformations take much more than that.
But I suppose I'm drilling down on what's changed in terms of the willingness to invest in politics. And that, to me, seems to be a big difference between American presidents during this kind of World War II period and the more recent American presidents, where there's a sense in which they're prepared to do the bombing and in some cases prepared to put boots on the ground, if you're thinking George W. Bush, but the political institution building, the societal investment isn't there.
No.
And that seems to me a big loss in America's willingness.
Yes.
In fact, even the language, the vocabulary, our unwillingness to use the word regime change in anything but a negative tone, right?
Yeah.
The connotations of that are singularly negative.
Yes.
And I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case.
No, regime changing the Nazis was a very, very good thing to do.
Absolutely.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And got to the root of it.
But that might, I think regime change in Iran, I think that's a moral good. I can't predict what follows, and we haven't had regime change yet to begin to know. But we lack, I think, a vocabulary to appreciate that American power can be used to actually dislodge regimes. That runs against our whole narrative that the West is a project that must be atoned for.
Well, I think picking up on, Zim's really pointing to the way that it's not a fault of the left insisting that we do acknowledgements of country that has prevented us from having that vocabulary. It is instead that the US is not investing any longer. So it can be a force for good, as we saw in World War II, as many American leaders hoped for in Vietnam, and many Americans themselves, people didn't, most people did not reject that war until quite late in the piece, same as in Australia, because there was a belief that it was a good thing to do. It didn't turn out well.
But it was absent any sort of international legal justification.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Vietnam War was outside.
That's true,
of the
but it
UN.
was a multilateral conflict, right? And there was a lot of support for it.
But I do wonder whether we don't exaggerate the extent to which there was a world order and that Trump has blown it apart. I think the actual opposite might be true. There was an absence of world order, and occasionally America would stand up for global rules, but mostly it wouldn't.
But now you sound like a lefty Marxist now, Tim, right?
Yes, I'm vast. I can tell you contradiction. But I do think there is it's not just the left, but I think that's predominantly where it's coming from, an insistence that international law would solve the problem. And I think in lots of ways international law has been the problem. And it's locked in bad regimes because legal niceties are more effective than morality. It's hard to defend Trump, and that's not where I would go. But he has attempted to change a narrative, and we are dealing with the dislocation of that change, both amongst allies and how we on campuses and everywhere else try and understand what he is up to.
I think, maybe that's why that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech resonated so strongly across the world, because he did name reality in that sense. He identified that international law is far from perfect. Of course it's far from perfect, and it was always unevenly applied. And we all knew that the rules never applied to the United States in the same way that they applied to everybody else. But there was a bargain at play that, we allowed that level of hypocrisy because on balance, those rules did keep a lot of people safe. They kept a global trading system relatively stable. And so we allowed those trade-offs because they worked for the vast majority of Western powers, and particularly those kind of mid-range powers. But by undermining even the kind of pretense, I suppose, Tim, of international law, Trump has pulled the rug out from under us in that sense and attempted to create a world totally without rules. And I think Carney again resonated so much because most people, including Americans, don't want to live in a lawless world. We do want structure. We do want, a sense that there are rules that keep us safer, and this idea that they're gone completely and we just live in a might is right world where an American administration can decide which regime they don't like, that it's not about, it's not a moral question, it's just which one they find the most annoying or which one Trump decides he needs to make a point with. Most people don't want to live in that world, and I think most nations recognise how dangerous that is for everybody. And I think, to get back to your question, Zim, that's what's changed, is that unspoken pact that we had with the United States has been torn up.
Yes, I just wonder whether it wasn't torn up in 2017 or in 2025. It was torn up in Vietnam. It was torn up over the Balkans. It was torn up over Iraq. It's just that our nowism, which I'm not accusing you of because you're a good historian, but our presentism, that in some ways what we're living through now is brand new, and Trump is this phenomenon who is unique, forgets how far America has always made international law suit its own national interests.
I mean, I think we can have both things at once, Tim. But
yes,
we don't have to choose.
I have this reservation that international law is not a faith or a religion; it's a function of power politics. And the greatest security we have, which is, you could say, in the Trump era is no security at all, is the democratic character of the United States itself. A nation with so much power, the most powerful nation on most metrics in the history of the world. What constrains it? The fact that it's a liberal democracy, it's a republic dedicated to unalienable rights. That I would trust to that. I'd trust to the U.S. Constitution much more than I would to the UN Charter.
I'd be more inclined to trust the electorate in the United States, who will not have the stomach for a long boots on the ground war again. And that, I think, that's sort of been playing through this whole conversation, which is the extent to which domestic electoral realities play into all of this. I mean, to that end, we could talk about the Epstein files. I feel obliged to mention them, at least, because nobody else is. And that is definitely one of the functions of this conflict. And has driven some of the decision-making, I suspect, in Washington. And
well, it's hard to know that. But yes.
Is it? I mean, the timing is quite,
I don't think this is... we could have a whole other session on Epstein, but it seems to me that there's such an ecumenical impact of that guy's behaviour. It falls on left and right.
Yeah.
That I don't think it's the political scandal that it could be if it were focused on one particular side of the spectrum. But does he choose? Did Bill Clinton choose to bomb Iran in 1998 to avoid dealing with the Lewinsky scandal? Well, possibly. But I'm sceptical.
Well, though that can be true, and my point can be true about Trump too. I mean, they are different moments, and
yes, to take on a big foreign war as a way of avoiding
the loss of power and possibly going to prison,
which will play out. That would play out anyway.
Will it though? I mean,
if
the political will dissipates,
I think there are much longer.
Yeah,
gestational.
I hope you're right, because he's all through those papers.
Conflict.
Yeah, he is.
Sorry, we were talking about different gestations.
Noam Chomsky appears. Bill Clinton appears.
No.
Bill Gates appears. I mean, all these powerful men, left, right, and neither, in some way are implicated.
Well, exactly. I mean, the whole thing will topple.
Topple what, though, Claire? Topple what?
Well, one would hope that all of these powerful men have been engaged in sex with underage people
but
is potentially dynamite for the political system.
It is, but I still don't see what the political effect is.
Well, they're going to shore up the two-party system and their power.
Well, again, if we're in the business of long bows, that is a bow, but I think it's a long one.
Maybe it's hedging too much, Claire, but I think we can have, again, we've got to be able to hold multiple things in our heads at once, that both things are true, that authoritarians do historically look for external enemies to consolidate their power at home. Simultaneously, it's useful as maybe a diversion. I'm reluctant to use the word distraction because I think Tim's right that Iran is part of a bigger structural issue, and it's also part of the Trump administration's desire to remake the role of the United States in the world and to remake the United States domestically. So it's part of a bigger radical project and also useful as a diversion, which Trump is using, I think, for Epstein, but he's also using as cover for pretty radical attacks on the democratic institutions that Tim was talking about. Like all of this is happening at once. This is the radical plan to radically remake US society at home and abroad. And that is hard, I think, to articulate clearly, because it's hard to believe that those structures that, we're so familiar with are changing so quickly at the same time that the essential conspiracy behind those structures through Epstein is being revealed, where we're seeing that, these powerful men were engaged in horrendous acts of abuse while also often, talking about and directing US foreign policy. Like, so much of the stuff in the Epstein files is about the United States' role in the world as well, and the exercise of men's power in the world, not just in the United States and over women.
Well, we could unpack that in multiple directions, but maybe that's a good place to park this topic and move to a different theme. Let's think about Australia. And Emma, you've just talked about how the United States is being remade, how it's being transformed by the Donald Trump presidency. America's becoming more volatile, less predictable, and perhaps less committed to the order it once claimed to lead. What kind of relationship should Australia now be pursuing with the United States and in its international relations more broadly?
I think a radically different one, Zim. Again, Australia's relationship with the United States is the product of history, as we've just been discussing. There's a lot of continuity, in fact, with the Trump administration and in how Australian governments are behaving. But, as Trump does with many things, he says the quiet part out loud. Right. And the mythology that Australia's foreign policy has been built around, since really the end of the Second World War, is that the United States will protect us. The United States will come to our aid if we should ever need them. Yeah. That was always a myth. The United States would only have ever done that if it was in its own interests. And again, Trump just makes that clear. He makes that fact undeniable and has made it clear that he has no interest in protecting allies. He's making that clear to allies of the United States in the Gulf as we are recording. And Australia, I think, or the Australian government in particular, has yet to come to face that reality. Okay. What I think is very interesting about this moment is that our polling indicates, by most measures, the Australian community is ahead of the government in this and is actually looking for quite a radically different relationship with the United States in the world. So faith in the Trump administration in particular is tanking. Yeah. Polling that we've done at the Australia Institute says that now a majority of Australians think that a more independent foreign policy is more in Australia's interests than a closer alliance with the United States, which indicates there's a pretty radical shift underway. That includes
a more independent defence policy as well?
That's my understanding, certainly. And that's a pretty difficult proposition for Australia, given our entanglement. But what I would argue is that defence relationship is what is pushing the Australian government to such a close alliance with the Trump administration, that relationship is now oriented to be pretty actively anti-democratic. But that's not inevitable, and actually that we can reframe the relationship to go back to what Claire mentioned earlier and the American electorate itself, and base that relationship on actual shared democratic values, which is what we hear all the time, and reinforce the relationship, for example, between our Parliament and the United States Congress, the relationship between elected representatives that is based on that underlying shared value in democratic systems and in democratic representation. So all of that is entirely possible, but it will require a pretty radical shift in thinking within the Australian government.
I ask you in the bluntest terms, what is the most important strategic reason to reduce the dependency on the United States in Australian foreign policy especially, defence policy, and what's the strongest case against doing that?
Sure. Look, I think the most important strategic reason, Claire, for reframing our relationship, our defence relationship in particular, is that the relationship at the moment, and especially under the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal, effectively cedes Australians' sovereign decision-making power to the United States. So it takes away our ability to make independent decisions about our own security. Strategically, that is a disaster under any administration, but it's particularly a disaster under this Trump administration, which is actively dragging Australia into illegal wars of choice without any conversation about that with our government, let alone with the Australian people. So strategically, to me, that's the imperative argument. I guess the argument against is that we are deeply, deeply entangled with the United States military-industrial complex, and actually extracting ourselves from that would be quite difficult. And I'm certainly not arguing for a total extraction. I think we're often, those of us who are deeply worried about the state of the relationship are often accused of wanting to abandon the United States, and that's not the case at all. Like, we're deeply concerned about what is happening in the United States, and care deeply about our American colleagues and our American friends and what they're going through. There are ways to support them through that look quite different to what we've got now, which is kind of getting off track a bit. But I think, the argument against totally disentangling ourselves is that we might lose the opportunity, I think, to engage in that kind of democratic solidarity. We might lose our leverage. I don't necessarily buy that argument, but certainly it's there.
And models? I mean, I'm thinking Germany is investing really heavily right now, right, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in its military capacity, having not done so for decades, partly because it wasn't allowed to, and then because it didn't seem necessary, and because investment was creating a much happier society in Germany for such a long time. Is that the kind of model that Australia would pursue if wanted some more independence? How would we actually do it?
I think so. I think,
so
practically.
Have to invest ourselves?
It's investing ourselves. It's not necessarily investing more money. Like, there's always this call for, we need to invest more in defence spending. Right. We actually already spend an extraordinary, eye-watering amount of money on defence. We just don't spend it very effectively. And so it's not necessarily more money. It's just a more effective use of money. And I think to go back to Tim's earlier point, a reconsideration of what we actually mean by security, what actually makes us safer. Yeah. And I think part of the model for that is an investment in our region and a consideration of what the actual threats are in our region. One of those threats, for example, is climate change. Yeah. Investing in actual mitigation would make us safer. But in terms of defence, certainly there are arguments for, closer cooperation with the French, closer cooperation with Japanese, the South Koreans, with nations in our region. All of that is entirely possible. It's difficult, and I don't want to underestimate the difficulty in particular of negotiating that with the current administration. That would be hard and risky, but I think that is well offset by the risks of staying on the same path.
And Tim, where do you come down on all of this? What's the best future for Australia?
Oh, well, I'm a great admirer of Emma's work, and she wrote a terrific book, very persuasive. I just didn't agree with it.
Shocked, Tim. I'm so shocked.
I think Emma's done a great job of giving us the complexities of seeking extraction from this imperium, which seems to me to be significant. I think, again, I fall like you'll be confounded by my falling back on a kind of cultural observation that Australia, as a modern cosmopolitan multicultural liberal democracy, rather like Germany, rather like the UK, has lost the vocabulary of nationalism. It doesn't know what requires defence because it doesn't really know what the nation is. So it's prioritised. I'm not picking any, they're all complicit, I think, in this. They prioritise a kind of de-emphasis of defence spending while upping welfare spending, doing all the warm fuzzy stuff, the absurd spending on mitigation of climate change. And all the while, they've lost this understanding of what the nation is and what the nation state is. Australia, I think, is a very good example of this, that our notion of nationalism is almost kind of frowned on, that we think nationalism is something that Pauline Hanson wraps into this racist narrative. And without an understanding of what it is about the nation that requires defending, you can't have an adequate defence position and you can't make wise determinations about who your allies should be. So I'm calling for something that's going to be it requires impossible cultural recalibration, but I don't see a way of changing our defence posture unless we're prepared to admit that Australia is actually worth defending.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead, Claire.
As one of the historians in the room, I mean, the question of what the nation is has always been hotly contested. I mean, it's always been contested, so there's nothing new in that. And I think if you separate patriotism from nationalism, I think plenty of Australians know exactly what we'd want to defend. I mean, you only have to go out in the street. I mean, not everyone cares about politics quite as much as those of us in the room. But, there's an enormous amount of pride, for example, in the electoral system in Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, especially compared to the United States. A degree of smugness, in fact, right? And the democracy sausage and all the rest of it. That is something that Australians can rally around. I mean, there's no question about that. The relative success of multiculturalism in this country, that is something, I mean, I know it's by no means perfect. That's something that people can rally around. I think there's the fact that we still have a Medicare and the Medicare card is something that most Australians, even my very conservative voting father, you take Medicare from his cold dead hands. He understands.
Oh, no, I don't dispute that.
Well, you said you did say let's not take the money and spend it more on welfare.
Well,
I mean, one could say that Medicare is a welfare.
With all respect, illustrating this kind of affection for the kind of warm, fuzzy things the government does.
What is nationalism? If
but this is my point. I think
there's some intrinsic Australianness.
What confounds, I think, your position is the fact that we haven't spent on Albanese's dilemma at the moment. In fact, it's less of a dilemma because he's got no choice here. He doesn't have the military capacity to be consequential. Keir Starmer in the UK is in a similar situation. They've prioritised spending on all these other priorities. We can argue about their fuzziness and their achievability. But we're not in a position, the UK and Australia, the two closest partners to the US, at least in their own self-conception, to actually be consequential in American-led wars. So and I would suggest that's the strongest illustration that we've lost the sense of what the nation is.
Although the support for the initial bombing of Iran that the Australian government expressed was all on the news all over the world. So we are consequential in some ways, right? That gave ballast to what was going on.
We can't sail battleships into
Well, maybe
action
one day we'll have nuclear-powered submarines.
Well,
we won't. We're never going to have...
This is one of the contradictions, perhaps in my position, that we can caricature how far it's invested in the welfare state, but that's got to be balanced against the fact that it's about to spend billions of dollars on a weapon system it may not actually get, and if it does get, it would compromise its sovereignty. So this isn't a straightforward defence spending good, fuzzy spending on welfare and climate change bad. It's more complicated.
Well, but just to go back to Emma's point about Australia spending a lot of defence but not in the right ways. I think this is quite an interesting juncture because, you raise a point that nationalism has been pretty low-key, poorly defined in the Australian context. I suppose one counter would be that's historically contingent. And the reality is that Australia, like the United Kingdom, has lived in a historical period recently that's been relatively safe. So, the nationalist impulses have diminished, but that context is changing. And clearly the risks are increasing, and one would expect that nationalist fervour might increase. This seems to be what happens over time. And in that situation, and we're seeing this, defence spending is going up in both countries. So the big question is, in both contexts, should the UK and Australia be doubling down on American manufactured goods, buying American submarines, or developing their own indigenous local defence industrial base, and in a sense creating independence through that? There's a big question of what the nation building in this defense strategic sense should look like. Should it be allied or bound to the United States, or should it seek a more independent posture?
Yeah, so our debate about how far America should extract Australia should extract itself from America does rather elide how far this will require getting further into bed with the People's Republic of China. And if we go down the net zero path, what we're actually doing is building dependency in that nation who provides all the kit that we're not able to produce because we're deindustrializing. That's a far greater concern, I think, for Australian security than its relationship with Washington. But we're not, for lots of complicated reasons, we're not prepared to have that conversation. But if we had the choice between dependence on one or the other, of course, I'd want the third option of being dependent on neither.
Okay.
I think I'd rather deal with the problems of dependence on the US.
But would you rather? But you hint that you'd rather independence than dependence on the US.
Well, for a middle power, we don't have the luxury of having an endless series of allies. We need to pick a side.
Well, do we? I mean, here's a question, right? Here's a proposition to make this a bit more concrete. Australia could reindustrialize. Probably over time, it takes a lot of investment and it happens slowly. And maybe the kinds of defense products that we produce are lower quality than the type we can get off the shelf from the United States. Is that strategy a better one than getting the higher quality products off the United States today?
Well, I think reindustrialization is a bit of a fantasy. It is for the US, and that is the closest. That's got greater potential to achieve it than ours. I think my point would be we have developed a set of priorities, which I'm not indicting. I think they're the wrong priorities or in the wrong order, in which we shift dependence on one power who at the moment is nasty and belligerent and making war, and move it towards another one that we're not prepared to have a full and frank conversation about the character of. And that it's Hugh White that puts this very clearly, that Australia want to benefit from Chinese wealth but be protected from its power. And the only way we've been able to resolve that to this point is by alliance with the United States. Now we can say, well, if we club together with those other nations that are skeptical of Chinese power, like Japan and South Korea, we can compensate for America's absence. I just think that is if it's not a fantasy, it's such a long-term game. It seems to me untenable.
Well, in the interests of us not going for 4 hours, I reckon we turn to our next topic, which is about Australia and populism. And over to you, Zim.
Okay. While we're focused on Australia, let's stay here for a little longer. Not much longer. A little For a long time, there was a fairly comforting idea in the Australian commentary that whatever our own problems, we're not going the way of the United States. In particular, a strong sense that Australian voters are closer to the centre than Americans because of the institutions, maybe the culture, maybe the ideals. We had a visitor on this podcast, Ned Foley, who spoke in glowing terms about the Australian electoral system and its effects on maintaining this kind of centrism. He'd like to see it imported into the United States. Now, that's the background. Of course, recent polling suggests that may be changing, and we shouldn't be so relaxed or sanguine about the state of Australian public opinion. Emma, when you look at Australian politics through the lens of the United States, what similarities concern you?
I think that the similarities that most concern me, Zim, are between the broadly defined left in the United States and in Australia, where I think at the moment we can see some quite striking similarities between the Democratic Party and the Labor Party, which are, and I'm generalising, given the interest of time, I think living in a world that no longer exists, where, we are relying on old ideas about political structures that just don't fly anymore. We have a Labor government that was elected with a stonking majority. That was in part, at least, I think, a repudiation of Trumpism in Australia that has then gone on to government and at every step betrayed, I think, that message and that promise, where it has tinkered around the edges of policy on a number of fronts, including defence, where it has sometimes doubled down on the policies of an opposition. And I think that is clearing the space, that is opening the space for other political voices in the same way that it has done in the United States. So that is deeply concerning for me. But I think it's always really important to note that, Australia is a radically different country to the United States with quite, as you were saying, dramatically different voting systems, one that I think we should be very proud of. We have very different and I think much stronger democratic institutions. But the idea that, it can't happen here and that we are immune from the waves of the far right, really, that are, that have re-risen in the United States, that are rising again in the United Kingdom and across Europe, the idea that we're immune from that, I think, is a really dangerous one. And I think the electorate has been clear to the Labor Party that, it is looking for structural change. It is looking for more, and there appears to be a significant reluctance on the part of the governing party to do that, where it's more focused on an old two-party system and, having an argument with an opposition that is increasingly irrelevant, I think.
Great analysis. I'd just switch it around entirely. The issue we have,
we've got a bit of a pattern going here, Tim.
It's a polite antagonist, isn't it?
the issue we have, I'm not saying, not denying there is not a far right threat, although it's much more amorphous than the way Emma lays it out. The problem we have in Australia is a left-wing cultural hegemony. And the absence of a viable opposition, whereas in the United States, although there is a clearly progressive cultural hegemony in many of the major institutions, including universities, there is a viable conservative movement, populist conservative right-wing movement that's been able to challenge it. We don't have that in Australia. We don't have a viable opposition in the current moment. That poses a problem. I'm a classical liberal as far as that means anything. I want both sides to have a healthy, reasonable position and not to get sucked into culture wars over race and gender. But that's where certainly the United States has gone, and where too much of Australia is taking its cultural leads from. We need to get back to a notion perhaps of class conflict or of class interest, something that the left have walked away from. And Trump has reminded the left that should have been their business. And if Trump presages something good, and it's possible that he does, it's a recognition by both sides of the spectrum that they need a different set of priorities.
I could not disagree with everything you've said more, but I will try and do it politely. No, in fact, I won't do it because we are short of time. I think I'll just say that it's always astonishing to me that conservatives imagine that there is a progressive hegemony, for example, in a university, where progressives bemoan, in fact, that universities are incredibly conservative.
Yes,
for example. Where is this hegemony? I want to move to that place.
Yes, but I think the corporate centre we're in, that's a very intriguing title. The way the corporatisation of the universities has proceeded is through the adoption of progressive cultural values. So it's not a genuine conversion. It's part of my problem with it, the whole welcomes and acknowledgements of country. It's not genuine. It's a way of institutions seeking some sort of security and insurance policy.
So it's not greenwashing so much as
progressive
washing.
Sociologist. I never used that phrase, but a very great sociologist called Musa Al-Gharbi has written a terrific book on this called "We've Never Been Woke." Unpacks this brilliantly.
Right, because you've actually got two things that are concerning you then. One is the fact that they're not properly conservative.
Yes.
Not properly progressive universities, for example, and this culture is not, in fact, properly
and it's
progressive.
on both sides. There's not a properly conservative. There's not a properly progressive.
But you've also
They're playing
asserted
a kind of culture war game.
But you've also asserted that there's a progressive hegemony. So
it is in part because of corporatisation of universities, but also through schools, through government departments. There is the way they've achieved some sort of cohesion and political power through the Labour majority that Emma has described is through the maintenance of this value system. Now, my position is not that that's uniquely bad or it doesn't represent some progress, because we're all in favour of that, but it's denying the other side the potential of developing a proper opposition. I want a strong left and a strong right where they contend for power and power changes hands. And that's not, I've overused the word vocabulary. In some ways, that's not the vocabulary that the institutions, the cultural institutions, the one we're in now, are comfortable with.
We want to go back to the 1980s and have good fights over economic policy.
Well, yeah, I'd much rather have fights over economics and class interest than these absurd fights over race and gender. And both sides are complicit in this downgrading of the discourse.
They're so closely linked. I mean, justice for, working class people is justice for working class people of colour as well as for white.
This is a whole other part, and we're into the whole intersectionality games now. But I think the left's significant failure is the loss of its understanding of class politics.
at the same time as everyone understands that fundamental to almost everything we've been talking about is wealth inequality and growing wealth inequality,
Yes,
and that is
absolutely.
driving all of what we're talking
Yeah,
about,
no,
right?
with
It's
it-
driving disaffection, it's driving
that, yes.
the election of Trump, for
Yeah,
example. Yeah.
absolutely.
And critically, it's worse in America than it is in Australia.
It is,
And
but
that's,
it
I
is
think,
getting worse here too, right?
That's
Yeah.
true. That's
Yeah.
true.
Yes.
But Australia's been insulated a little bit in that regard.
Yeah.
We've at least benefited from more stable economic growth over time and a better distribution
Yes, I mean,
of
the
the
elephant in
rewards
the
of
room
growth.
here is what we call the GFC.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a cultural, not just an economic depression, but a cultural transformation of American society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have no comparative
Yeah.
event that we had to live through.
Yeah.
So we've not had to adjust. Whereas the United States has gone through a series of dislocations and adjustments because of the profound effect of it,
Yeah.
that recession.
That is true.
Yeah.
All right, we should move on, shouldn't we, to looking ahead?
We should. We've looked back to the 1980s. Let's look forward just a few months, not grand sweeps of time. And let's turn to domestic politics in the United States, and in particular the midterm elections, which are upcoming later this year. They'll obviously matter a great deal. Historically, they've often acted as a check on a president's agenda, but history only gets you so far in predicting the future, I've been told by my historian friends.
Oh, I thought you were just going to say history only gets you so far.
Well, historians only get you so far as well. Oops. And the deeper question is whether the institutions that are supposed to absorb political shocks are still functioning in the way that people assume they are and the way they've worked in the past. Tim, when you look at the midterms, what are you expecting? And are they likely to constrain Trump in any meaningful way?
Oh, I think because we're political scientists, you and I, and we're paid to predict the future. As
Yeah.
historians are paid to dwell on the past.
They're paid to not be wrong.
So, but I will,
Want to be plausible at least.
I will go back to historical precedent, and with only a couple of exceptions, the governing party, and that is the Republicans, take a kicking in the midterms.
Yep.
There's everything to suggest that kicking will be quite severe, given we've got an Iran war which is going wrong. We've got the inflationary effects which were present before that, but have been catalysed by it. And we have. I've spent the last couple of weeks in the United States, and it's almost a cliche, but the price of gas is a very strong predictor of political electoral discontent. And Trump, unless he's got 6 months to try and change that, which means opening the Strait of Hormuz, which is not straightforward, unless he can change that, he will suffer the consequences of the economic effects of his ideological war.
And just briefly, what does the political cascade look like if Trump loses, if the Republicans lose their majorities in Congress?
Yes, well, it pains many on the left to have to acknowledge that Trump is 80 years old in June. He is in the final 3 years of his presidency. He will be dead, one would suggest.
Statistically
Statistically speaking, if some event doesn't intercede, his political time is passing. It could be, and I've been making these predictions since 2025, if not since 2017, but we are inevitably going to reach a peak Trump moment where he goes into eclipse and becomes a proper lame duck, where the Republican Party starts to go to war with itself over his successor, and please God, the Democrats learn a new way of countering Republicans, which doesn't rely on Trump derangement syndrome. So everything, I can create a plausible, optimistic scenario that as Trump goes into eclipse, the system will restore itself. It's not certain, but I think there's enough in American history to suggest this capacity for transformation has not been lost, and we're on the moment of a transformation.
Okay.
Emma, you looked like you wanted to say something.
I think that, particularly your last point, Tim, is entirely possible. The United States has a remarkable history of revitalising itself, particularly out of crisis. But unsurprisingly, I disagree with the framing of all of that, because while you're absolutely right that in what we might consider a normal political cycle, the Republicans are heading for a wipeout at the midterms, that historically it suggests that is where we're heading. But that is making the assumption that we're in a normal political cycle. And I think that assumption needs to be interrogated. It might be right, but it might also be wrong. I think Trump delivered the conservative movement that you've described in the United States a generational victory in the last election. He got them the executive branch, he got them the Supreme Court, he got them Congress. They will not give that up easily, and they have made that very, very clear. Trump is already laying the groundwork, as I think Zim was hinting, for a total erosion of faith in the results of the midterm elections, whatever they are, even as the administration is engaged in a very detailed, very active project of undermining the integrity of the electoral process. And this is by no means a prediction. I'm a historian. We don't do that. It is simply to observe that nothing is inevitable in this political cycle that we are in, and I'm not sure that assuming that the midterms will, proceed as normal, or that come 2028, we'll have an endpoint to this. I don't think the movement, which may descend into chaos, but it may not. I don't think the movement gives that up easily.
Well, I think the other thing history teaches us is every moment of crisis in a nation that may have had elections, very few people predicted it would go as badly as it did.
Yeah.
Thinking of the 1930s is the perfect example. And we all look back and think, why didn't people leave the places that were going that way? Because they too thought that the systems and their neighbours and fellow citizens would correct things. So, difficult to be sure, but And I know too that there are certain stakes in us from this distance predicting one way or the other, right? We have a lot less to lose here than all of the Americans we know, and indeed all of those who will be subject to American power in a more direct way than we are in Australia. Yeah.
I do wonder, though, if some historical equilibrium is restored in America, to follow off what Tim was saying, American institutions are restored to some extent. Does that change how you think about what Australia should do and what we were discussing before?
Well, it doesn't. But Trump has been a very poor institution transformer. He's kicked them around.
Yeah.
I think the universities have taken a kicking, but will just wait him out. He's not an FDR or an LBJ, whose legacy was assured by institutional transformation. He passes executive orders. These are ephemeral. The next guy or gal that comes in will just write a new set or erase the ones that he's put in. So I struggle to see how you've got a Trumpian revolution embedded in the institutions. The institutions have proved really quite resilient in the face of this attack. It requires a genuinely revolutionary leader. Trump could presage this, but could it be a Rubio or a Vance that actually takes on the institutions in a much cleverer way? Possibly. But I think the institutions are, it's part of my continuity thesis, they are sufficiently robust, they move at a glacial pace, that an electoral calendar is too short a time in which to transform them.
Okay.
I hope that you're right. I mean, the Supreme Court is a really good litmus test, right? And they're holding back on a couple of decisions that have been long expected, and I wonder why. Like the Voting Rights Act, for example, which if they come down the way they were expected to on Section 2, obliterates what's left of that and completely changes the electoral makeup in some really key states.
It does. But he's also lost in that Supreme. It's supposed to be his longest lasting legacy, is getting his people on the Supreme Court, but they're voting him down. His tariff tax, his whole economic foreign policy was dismantled by a Supreme Court that's supposed to be in his pocket. So the institutions are, even ones controlled by Republicans nominally, are proving resistance to Trump in his final years.
Out of Tim's mouth to whatever God you believe in's ears, Trump in his declining years.
And what do you think, Emma? Does this change any of the prognosis for Australia?
I don't think it should.
Okay.
I certainly think there's a sense in the Australian government that, Australia can wait out Trump, can wait till the midterms, can wait till the United States rights itself. But that's potentially a long way off. My argument has been for a long time that the America we thought we knew is gone
Yep.
and it's not coming back. Something else may emerge in its place. We don't know what that might be. Waiting around to see is very dangerous for Australia. It presents us with significant new risks. But I think the flip side of that is we often underestimate our own power and agency here in Australia. You know, there's this suggestion that we do just have to kind of wait and see, batten down and try and kind of bear the worst of it as best we can. You know, we're actually something like the 12th or 13th biggest economy in the world, commensurate with the size of Russia. We do have significant influence in the world, and Australian diplomacy has played a huge role in shaping the world, in building institutions that keep us safer, including the UN Charter. And we underestimate what an investment in that kind of diplomacy and that kind of security can actually build. And I think if we wait around to see what happens in the United States, we risk being left behind as the rest of the world engages in building something new out of the chaos of the Trump administration.
So just looking ahead in the short or perhaps medium term, not necessarily about elections, but in general, what are you two watching closely in the United States that may or may not have an impact on Australia that perhaps we haven't covered yet? Is there anything in particular you think listeners should be looking at?
Well, I watch with eagerness, but a degree of depression, how the next leader of the Democratic Party presents him or herself. And I see some evidence that they're capable of transcending their anti-Trumpism, somebody like a Josh Shapiro getting the nomination. But I'm also concerned that they are so stuck on Trump as this kind of drug that they'll go kind of left as the Republicans have gone kind of populist and go with someone like an AOC. And I think that compounds the problem. So I think important leaders in any democratic system transform the nature of their opponents. And I'm still waiting to see how Trump and the age of Trump has changed the Democratic Party and made it to a much more formidable electoral machine. And I see some evidence, but not enough to make me confident.
So you're not gunning for Bernie Sanders?
Well,
No?
again, old man. I mean, part of the Democrats' problem is that they've either got an AOC who's too young, or they've got this old guard like Bernie Sanders that are too old, even though he's not technically a Democrat anymore. And they need somebody, and not a Gavin Newsom. No. They need somebody like a Josh Shapiro.
There
That we can agree
We
on.
have found common ground, probably for different reasons. Emma.
I mean, I'm actually watching, Claire, really what's happening outside the United States. And I think how traditional allies, including Australia, but more broadly, how traditional allies of the United States are reacting to what they're seeing happening in the United States, where we have this situation where democratic governments are being squeezed from both directions. You know, there's downward pressure from a Trump administration that is treating allies with such utter contempt, and upwards pressure from an electorate that is increasingly seeing what is happening in the United States and expressing deep concern about that and about their relationships with, or their government's relationships with the United States. So for me, it's watching how that pincer movement, I think, affect how governments behave and how they begin to largely quietly reshape their relationships with the United States.
Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much for all of that. We could continue, I feel, for several hours, but I think this has been such a good episode for taking stock of where we're at, and we probably want to get you both back here next year. So we should stop here in the interests of your...
of us not going on until next year.
Yes, but also so that you want to come back onto the show again. We can check some of these predictions and generally take stock maybe in 2027. Thank you so much, Emma Shortis and Tim. It's really been great having you on
pleasure.
Presidency Pending.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And to those of you listening or watching on YouTube or on your preferred platform, please share Presidency Upending, not pending any longer, with your friends, your associates, your most staunch enemies. And we will look forward to seeing you next time. This is Presidency Pending. Damn it, I got the name wrong! Wow. This is... wow. Shut the screen, I said. We surely know it by now.